So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great pleasure for me, first time at the forum, to be in the position of moderator and not discutant. So I hope I will be able only to moderate and give the floor to my honored guests. So, first of all, let me introduce the guests of this panel today. It's a great honor for me to welcome Madam Oleksandra Drik, head of the board, Civic Illustration Committee, Ukraine. Then, yes, welcome. My dear friend, Edward Lucas, editor of The Economist, United Kingdom. Mr. Carl Gershman, President, National Endowment for Democracy from United States. And Mr. Ralf Fücks, President Heinrich Böll Foundation from Germany. As usual, the topics and issues are not easy at all, and we would try to answer questions like, where are the real leaders today? Why we are facing followers, but not leaders? Why such a pressure and orientation on public opinion polls trying to keep attitudes and positions of citizens, but which are created by the statements of politicians? Why we are enclosed in such a circle? Why there are more emotions inside the politics than rational answers, and have a rationality chance to win in the struggle with populists' emotions? It is necessary to be a real hero, to have a courage to be leader at present days. Mr. Żantowski yesterday at TV said, wonderful sentence, and I think precise also for this today panel. Mr. Havel was the person who usually has said non-popular truths. And what we are facing today are followers in politics who are saying popular non-truths. So how we can change this atmosphere and return the trust to the principles of real liberal democratic regimes. Now I will give the floor for my guests at the panel. They will have 5, maximum 7 minutes to their introductory remarks, trying to answer these questions. Then further questions, if you do not mind, from my side, and then I will give the floor to all of you, and you can either have a statement or question to the panel, so we can try to find at least 2, 3 positive messages and answers, because negative messages you can read each minute in our newspapers. So our role is more complicated. Oleksandra, how you see it? Where are the real leaders where there is such deep distrust and dissatisfaction? Some political sciences are saying and analyzing distrust citizen, missed citizenship, or some political sciences are saying we are living in post-truth period. So what have happened and what we can do?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. You know that Ukraine has been in news for many years, and the problems that we are facing now are actually affecting everyone in Europe and all over the world. So it's important for me to explain to you what is really happening in Ukraine and how we can address those problems and how we can make the world a better place for every single person of us. First of all, I'm almost as young as Ukrainian democracy, so many of you would probably have better answers than I do. So I would speak not globally, I would speak from the perspective of a Ukrainian who has been a part of all revolutions in Ukraine for the past 25 years and who is now been involved in all those changes that Ukraine is going through. So I have been asking myself a question: why is that one of the richest countries in the European continent is one of the poorest? Why for 25 years we didn't have any decent leaders? The only one decent leader in the modern Ukrainian history was assassinated in the 90s. And since that we had an ongoing process of turning Ukraine into an oligarchic state controlled and owned by people who are acting in their own interest rather than the interest of the state. It has all started with the non-transparent privatization that formed the oligarchic groups who are very closely linked and tied to political elites. They are the political elites, if we can use this phrase in this context, because they decide what path Ukraine is choosing, and again, they're not acting in the interest of the population of Ukraine, they're acting in their own interests. So, two revolutions that Ukraine have had for the past decade. The first, the Orange Revolution in 2004, and the second, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. We were expecting them to bring some change to what the system is in Ukraine like. But what we see now, these revolutions did not bring any new leaders, new state leaders, who would be willing to actually reform the state and change the status quo in the country. But what it did change, the last revolution, it's the formation of the civil society. We have been finally forming the true active civil society who can influence the decision-making process in Ukraine. And that's the reason why, since the revolution in 2014, we actually have some successes. We have the progress. We have launched a series of very powerful anti-corruption reforms. And you know that Ukraine basically has two fronts. It's the war front, where we fight with Russia, and the second one is the anti-corruption front, because corruption is something that has been ruining the state for 25 years. So, first of all, we understand that purification of the government from those who are not acting in the interest of the state is the primary goal. So first we launched the illustration process. The organization I'm chairing has drafted the law on purification of the government that had two aims. First aim is to prevent those non-democratic elites of the previous regime to take back their offices. And it has been successful for up to 90%. Second aim is fighting against corruption. We understand that those who have been becoming rich by the expense of the state have to be found out, they have to be punished, and they have to be removed from the government. And the second, the second aim of the illustration, that was to identify those corrupt officials via verification of declarations, of their asset declarations, has completely failed, unfortunately. So we concentrated on launching the new electronic system of declarations, and that has been in use about Ukraine for the last 6 months, because the launch of e-declaration system is one of the main conditions for visa-free regime between European Union and Ukraine. And we have been facing numerous attacks from the current political elites that do not want this electronic system of asset declaration to be launched, including the president, including the cabinet of ministers, including the heads of other state agencies that are supposed to be willing to bring this change. I have counted 12 attacks, to be precise, for 6 months, including usage of the Constitutional Court, including amendments, proposing amendments to the legislation, including usage of law enforcement agencies that are all under control of the current political elites. So today we're actually celebrating, well, today is the 2nd anniversary of the illustration law, and today, while I'm here, there is a negotiation in the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine. I would be there if I wasn't here. They will be deciding on the next attack on the declaration. Thank God we have more people in Ukraine from civil society who will be there so they can protect the declaration once again. But what is more important, we would not be able to launch the system and to start this fight against corruption in Ukraine and to bring true reformists to the government if there is no help from the European society. We wouldn't have been able to be where we are now without your support. But we wouldn't be able to do that if there is no real understanding how important this is to Ukraine, and in the end, how important this is to the entire European Union. I remember one quote of Václav Havel that I adore. It's better to have 5 years of mistakes than 50 years of sabotage. So, if you ask me what we need to do to bring new leaders, first, we need to purify the government from those old leaders who are not interested in bringing any change to the state. And we have introduced these instruments. What we need now to make it work. And second, we need to fight against this counter-revolution that is happening now in Ukraine. And new leaders emerging in Ukraine are actually capable to do that. But they still need some time, some help, some resources to get trained, to know how the system works, and to be able to counteract. So if you ask me how to do that, I would say that we're all doing everything right. We just need to be more strict in what we're doing. And we don't need compromises in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fight with corrupted political elite as a major answer why there is not enough trust to political elite. Corruption as one major feature in an important part of Europe at present. So I think we can exchange experiences. It's for not one day fight, you know it.
I do.
Edward, how you see the answers?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Iveta, and it's wonderful to be here in such friendly and distinguished company. One of the things that really strikes me about this panel is that, Iveta, you are actually a full politician. You're a former Prime Minister, you fought and won and lost elections. And it always makes me a little bit nervous when someone like me who works at a think tank in Washington and The Economist, starts lecturing politicians on what they should do. I don't think if people came to me at The Economist and said, why don't you write more articles about politics in Central Europe because it's so important, I would appreciate it, particularly because I would say we have to do, provide more or less the sort of things that our readers want. So I think there's something, we need to have a little bit of humility as non-politicians if we start giving recommendations to politicians. But I do think also we can praise politicians when they get things right. And when I listened to President Kiska last night, I did not feel there was a crisis of democratic leadership. I was really pleased, and I thought it was in the best traditions of the forum, and I was thrilled to see a leading Central European politician coming out with what you so rightly called unpopular truths. And I think we can also learn from Ukraine. I was just saying to Sasha beforehand that it's very easy for us in the still reasonably comfortable and safe part of Europe to be rather introverted about our own democratic problems. But Ukraine has shown that it's possible to maintain a functioning constitutional order, rule of law, contested elections in conditions of incredible financial, constitutional and geopolitical difficulty, and that's something that we should all be paying attention to, as well as, of course, of helping Ukraine. But I think the fundamental problem here is what I call post-1989 complacency. That when we won the Cold War in 1989, we made two big assumptions, and they were both, I think, over-optimistic. One was that because our Western system had won, it was therefore basically perfect. And the second was that because it had won, it would continue to win forever. And both of those assumptions, I think, deserve scrutiny. They were flawed. There was plenty wrong with the Western economic system and the Western political system back then in '89, and many of the problems we had then we haven't fixed. And new things have come along since then, which have made life more difficult. Now, I know later on we're going to be talking about the threats from authoritarian regimes and all the things that they do to try and undermine our system, so I won't touch on that. But there are things inside our system that act in a very corrosive and unpleasant way. One of them is money. Not a new problem. We had financial scandals in West German politics, for example, in the mid-'80s, some of us may remember. But the role of money in democratic politics is a really difficult one, and I don't pretend to have an answer to it. I see strong arguments on all sides. But I think what is clear is it raises the bar for outsiders wanting to get into politics, and politics always benefits some outsiders, if your admission ticket to get into politics is having a bunch of friendly businessmen or other people who are willing to bankroll you. If the price for admission to politics is a few $1 million or euros or pounds, it makes it very difficult for your ordinary public-spirited outsider to get in. And it also, of course, distorts and entrenches the insiders in politics who try to keep it as a game just for them. A second thing which is really new is the changes in the media. And this, again, it distorts the political field and it deters outsiders. If you realize that everything you've ever done as a private citizen outside politics is going to be put on social media, and you're going to be ridiculed for stuff you did as a student or in your 20s or your 30s or whenever, many people just think, I don't want that. I don't want the exposure that's going to bring to me and to my family. And I think, although I'm the last person to sympathize with Donald Trump, as those of you who follow my writings know, I do worry that the American election is being settled on the basis of who can dig up the most dirt about the other side, on things that each candidate thought they were doing in private, whether it was a private email or private conversation. If we make democracy and democratic contests into a competition about who can dig up and throw the most dirt, it will distort the political arena, and it will also deter people from going in and increase this crisis of elites. Then, of course, there's the whole business of reality TV, and I think we've turned politics into a form of entertainment, where you think that the most famous person is the most attractive person, and the media has a huge responsibility in this, that we basically treat politics as showbiz, and that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump was treated seriously. seriously because he was a major showbiz figure, and of course you cover showbiz because that's where the audiences are. Again, I don't really have an answer to this, but it's a problem that was beginning back in the 80s, and it's become much worse ever since. Then there's another problem, which is our system doesn't work very well for a large chunk of the people. And these are the people, people who voted for Brexit, people who voted for Trump, people who are voting for AFD in Germany, or the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, or many other parties elsewhere. And we can't wish that away. There is a chunk of people who feel humiliated, who feel alienated, who feel resentful, who feel fear and uncertainty and doubt about the future, and feel that the political elite simply doesn't speak for them. And that is a destabilizing factor in our democracy. It's one we just have not been able to find an answer to. I'm reminded of the great poem by W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming, when I look around Europe and North America and the other democracies. And the line is this: the best lack all conviction, and the worst have a passionate intensity. And I think the solution to this is not an easy one. It's kind of complicated but simple at the same time. It's difficult but simple. And which is that democracy doesn't happen by accident. We can't just sit back and say, because we won the Cold War, democracy is going to be fine. Democracy is like public health, it's like education, it's like other public goods. It needs care and feeding. We need to think about what's good for democracy and what's bad for democracy, and actively engage in trying to create conditions in which democracy can flourish. We need to build trust, we need to improve education. We need, most of all, I think, to remember that democracy is not about elections. Democracy is about what happens in between elections. And if all things that happen in between elections are okay, then the election will be okay as well. But the trouble with focusing too much on elections in democracy is they become kind of showbiz events, and we ignore all the things that are happening in between. And I suppose my final point is that what kept us going during the Cold War in the West was that we were scared. And we were really scared. We were scared of nuclear war. We were also scared that we might lose. My earliest memory as a 6-year-old is my parents discussing the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. But all through the late 60s and 70s, we thought that communism might win. And we were scared about that, and it imposed a kind of discipline and clarity on what we did, because we thought we have to make our system work at home, because if it doesn't, it might lose. People might actually start thinking communism is better. And my rather depressing conclusion from that is that we are not going to be able, I think, to reboot our democracy and make it work and end this crisis of democratic leadership until we're a bit more scared. The moment it's much easier to be angry with ourselves than it is to be scared of our adversaries. I think we should be scared of our adversaries. I fear that we're going to have plenty more reason to be scared of them, and a lot more scared in the years ahead. And maybe that will then cause us to focus on the things that we need to change.
Thank you very much. Several messages, but I think we can concentrate later on the message that there are positive examples of real leaders, also among the politicians. Maybe the mistake is to put all of them to one package of those who are without real leadership and without authority. To show examples and to help them and support this kind of leaders and distinguish in between followers and leaders very precisely, and to concentrate on each step of what have happened in between elections, building democratic institutions and regulations which could support democratic procedures, because it's true that we need to offer the answers why people feel that the system is not doing quite well. So how Karl see this issue?
Oh, I'll try to give a simple answer to that complicated question. Thank you, Iveta. While I was coming over on the plane, I reread something I got about almost 8 years ago. It was an open letter to the Obama administration that was signed by Havel, along with Martin Buderer, Sasha Vondra, Karl von Schwarzenberg, and a number of other people. And it was a kind of a geopolitical statement of concern, fearing that the U.S. was going to abandon this region and that Russia was back to becoming a revisionist power with a 19th century agenda using 21st century methods. I think we know from this talk that was given last night by President Kiska that as bad as you may have feared the situation was back in 2009, it's an awful lot worse now. He spoke about the return of an unpleasant history of extremism, nationalism, anti-democratic populism. But the problem is also a very, very dramatic deterioration in the geopolitical situation, not only in this region with Crimea, Ukraine, the assertion of Russian power, also the devastation that's taking place in Syria, the greater assertiveness of China, Iran, and so forth. It's a very deteriorated world order, but also, and perhaps most urgently, it's also a problem in our so-called democratic homeland. Havel did not have the kind of post-1989 complacency that Edward just spoke about. In 1998, in a discussion with Adam Michnik, he said that the crisis we face, this is 1998, is deeper than a democratic crisis. It's a crisis of civilization involving the disintegration of human bonds, the loss of a sense of responsibility, the title of this conference, and a totally, these are Havel's words, a totally unbridled self-interest. And we all know that this is a problem that we face, and it's complicated by globalization and the dislocation that a lot of people who are not part of the elite feel in this period of economic globalization, a loss of control over their own destinies. Last night, President Kiska spoke about, the inability of our countries to really respond to this crisis. He spoke about what he called a fool's pride of complacency, and it has many causes. It's greed, certainly, that Havel was so concerned with, fear of the bullying by some of the autocratic powers, ignorance, a lack of understanding what we're dealing with, a lack of imagination and historical memory. I almost feel today like if you defend universal values, it's almost like a declaration of war against the autocrats. You can't do that. You're being called confrontational. And frankly, it also certainly has something to do with the rather drastic swings in my own country between what is called maximalism and minimalism. And we're in a very dramatic minimalist period now in the withdrawal of U.S. leadership in the world, and that has very destabilizing consequences. So we're dealing with all of this and thinking about how to respond to it. I keep coming back to what Havel spoke about, living in truth. There was a point I remember in early 1990 when there was a big conference, and Timothy Garton Ash said, living in truth was what you do in communist countries. In democracies, you work in half-truth. Well, it's not true. And I think that's what we know now. Living in truth is a permanent responsibility. It involves acting with integrity, acting with honesty, acting with a sense of responsibility and realism about the state of the world, and not being dominated by narrow concerns, especially narrow economic concerns that Havel, at a meeting we had in 2009 in Ukraine, called suicidal. Yes, we need a sense of responsibility toward dissidents, toward people who are on the front lines of the struggle for freedom and democracy, but the failure to behave in a spirit of solidarity was also something that would undermine our concrete national security interests. He felt it was suicidal. Question is, what do we do now? Let me just take the opportunity of speaking here this morning to say that the NED has been in discussion with Forum 2000, Jakub and Michael Jantovsky at the Havel Library to try to create a new global association of thinkers and intellectuals to try both to understand the complex new realities that we face, and also to become an advocate for democratic values. One has to both reaffirm democratic values and first principles. We also have to think anew about how we manifest these principles, defend these principles in a complex era of globalization. In Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech that he gave in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, he said, we not only have to, practice what we preach, we have to learn how to preach what we practice. We practice democracy. How do we defend democracy? How do we understand democracy? How do we talk about democracy? And we're going to have to do that anew. And I think that working with Forum 2000 and the Havel Library and NED, and to try to bring together people who think about these issues to become both a group that can help try to reinterpret these values in the contemporary reality, but also to become an advocate for this. I know this is a very awesome, a very difficult task. You're really talking about how do you change the world. And one thing that Havel said in those discussions with Michnik was he says that none of us as an individual can save the world as a whole, but each of us must nevertheless behave as if we had the power to do so. And I think if we act that way, and act truthfully, without illusion, and without a sense of elitism, we can try to speak to the problems that exist today, develop the will to both deal with the very dangerous geopolitical situation that we face, and also try to revive democracy in our own countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so how to defend the principles of democracy in such an atmosphere, and how to recover the real values and maybe ethics. Very hard task, but we are here to try to solve, partly at least, such tasks. Ralf, please, how you see the role of leaders and where are they?
Thank you very much. In preparing this panel, I stumbled a little bit over the title, Democratic Leadership, Crisis of Democratic Leadership, and asked myself, is this at the core of the crisis of liberal democracy we are facing today? And I think we, at least here, the panel, we all have the same kind of notion that we are in midst of a historic battle over the future of the global order and the future of our democracies and the future of Europe. And there's not only this challenge by very self-assertive authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. The battle is happening in our societies itself. A kind of clash of civilizations, but in another meaning than Huntington was thinking about it. We have this clash between the concept of an open society, of cultural and ethnic diversity and political pluralism, of economic globalization and European integration in our own societies. We have it in the West, we have it in the Central East of Europe, we have it in the opposition with these populist parties and movements, and we have it in the governments. If you're looking to Poland or Hungary, the concept of illiberal democracy, which is kind of joke, a contradiction in itself. And yes, I would say partly this is a crisis of democratic leadership. If we think about what is democratic leadership about, political leadership in a democracy, about trust, credibility, and responsibility. What are you standing for? Which kind of values and which kind of long-term goals are you following as a politician? And are there any values which are not at sale to gain power or to stay in power? Second dimension, providing orientation, or a kind of long-term narrative political decisions have to be embedded in. This is especially needed in times of stormy change. You need this kind of orientation to gain a sense of trust. A third aspect, responsivity, so listening to the people, talking to the people, but at the same time being ready, as it has already been mentioned, not only to tell the non-popular truth, instead the popular lies, but to take the hard decisions which are needed sometime, even if they are non-popular. And if we are looking back the last years, there had been, I would say, some political fatal errors which with very severe and long-term consequences. For instance, Syria, that the West was not able to make up our minds to intervene in Syria with a non-flight zone when it was possible with, I would say, limited political and military risk, and leaving a vacuum in which this war could unfold and Russia could intervene. So, defining red lines without any consequences comes with a price. And another very critical point about the future of Europe and the credibility of our democracies is Ukraine. To be very clear, Ukraine today is a kind of litmus test, a proof. If we stick to our democratic values and if we stick to the idea of a united and democratic Europe, this is not only about Ukraine, it is about the future of Europe. And we need a very, very clear attitude here. And finally, it's about performance. This has already been mentioned. So, and we have not been very good over the last, let's say, 15 years or so in terms of institutional reforms, providing equal opportunities to everybody, to develop a new inclusive, socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable model of growth, and to create a sense of confidence in our societies that democracy will be able to successfully deal with the challenges of globalization and this rapid change political, societal, and technological change our societies are facing. And without this kind of this sense of trust or self-confidence, liberal democracy will not prevail. So it is not only about sticking to our values, it's about bringing our home in order and doing the necessary work we need to modernize our economies and to renew then our democracies. And if we are looking for the new democratic heroes, the new Havels, we should not only look to the political elites. Civil society is a very important power. And the new democratic heroes in the last years, you mainly find them in civil society, at the Maidan, in Kiev, or in the resistance in this, I think, marvelous revolt against the abortion law in Poland. So civil society matters, and it's not only about professional politics, it's about us.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very, very much. I would continue, if you do not mind, with the conclusions of Ralf to push us a bit further. So, okay, we know for a decade or more that because of globalization, technologization, new wars, creation of new states, etc., there are real changes in the societies. Economists have formulated this 15 years ago at Davos, or before in many studies, that there are two major challenges as a new phenomena, and we have to respond. First, new social differentiation in the world, connected with distribution of common wealth. And they pointed out, be careful. Distribution of common wealth is very far from what we can call justice. Because look at the new social stratification, concentration of the 10th percentage of whole wealth in the world, and then the rest of societies. So total change in social stratification with unbalance in justice and understanding of crucial distribution of common good to everybody. And second moment, interconnected with not adequate answers of political decision makers to these changes in the societies. So, no response how to return the confidence, the trust towards common wealth and common governance and participation on this governance. So briefly, more information, less informed citizens, more globalization, more atomized societies as a reaction, more atomized society, less participation in the good common sense. Plus, major shift, more atomized society, less informed society, more space for extremism and populism as a part of their orientation in the society. These are new trends, but our institutions are behaving like nothing has changed. So we have old-fashioned structure of democratic institutions facing changed social and economic and political reality. Look, always when we are in trouble, if I say we are, I mean politics and politicians, we are looking on active civic society. Come on, help, help, solve the problem. It was clear during Mečiarism in Slovak Republic. It's absolutely clear now in Poland or in Hungary, but also in Italy and all other countries around the world. Yes, civic society is an important pillar of democratic system, but how we can really improve the position of civic society, as Edvard has mentioned, between elections, so they can prepare the atmosphere for real changes in the societies. Can civic society support the creation of real leaders for democratic systems? And last but not least, is Trumpization really the Trump in the politics? It means populist rhetoric will be the real winner? If yes, then I have a fear, and I have mentioned it yesterday, first time in my life, I have a fear from the behavior of political representation. Partly because they are absolutely not under the control. So, what we really can do, what we really actively can do.
What we really?
Sorry?
I didn't get the last
what
question.
We really actively can do against this kind of politics, to stop this kind of politics, in all the circumstances in the societies.
I think this is...
Ralf?
This is a very complex question, but to try to find a basic answer to that. I guess it's about providing a sense of basic safety in times of rapid change. Mm-hmm. So my reading of the current crisis of liberal democracy is that it is very much about the loss of this confidence that our societies will keep their inclusive character in the future, socially inclusive then character, that, as you mentioned, you know, it's at least in Europe, but I think as we see also in the United States now, it is very much about a sense of social justice. So liberty and social justice have to go together. And if people have the impression that we are losing the social balance, if fear of social decline is gaining ground in our societies, if the gap between rich and poor is becoming bigger, if people don't any longer think that the future of their children will be better, or at least if there's the opportunity that future for children will be better than for the parents' generation, we are running into a problem. Mm-hmm. We are running into a problem. And this is not just, as you, I think, rightly touched upon, about the distribution of private income. It is very much about providing public institutions and public services which are at the core of the democratic republic. Public education, public health, empowering people, encouraging people to deal with change instead of being in fear of change. So I think we neglected, since the 90s, we neglected the importance of public institutions for social coherence and support of democracy. And we have to rethink our model, the priorities of public spending. And at the same time, we have to deal with the gap between national sovereignty and economic globalization. This is what the European Union should be about, an answer to economic globalization by pooling sovereignty and restoring the ability of politics to shape the markets and to be in control of the economy. And I think these are the two basic challenges we have to deal with to win the battle against these populist movements with their extremely dangerous and illusionary response that we could shield ourselves against change, that we could shield ourselves against globalization, that we could go back into a kind of homogeneity which is for a long time, it's already over.
I think we have to say the truth. And the truth is that it's not the risk for the future that the children's position will be worse or not so good like the position of their parents. The truth is that there is a first generation after the Second World War, young generation, whose position and status is worse than the status of their parents. This phenomena is already here. We are facing this phenomena of young generation, and we are facing another phenomena, interconnected. You have mentioned it. There are all generations already totally dependent on public redistribution of finances and resources. Whole generations. Therefore, there is big pressure on social and public services and public expenditures in the situation of less economic resources which are available for this kind of duties. So on one side, young generation, on another side, older generation, for example, which is totally dependent on public expenditures. And I think you are absolutely correct that there is no national state answer, political answer to global economy challenges. That we need to find a way of global political answers to global economic issues. But how, Edward?
Well, I think as a Brit, I have to begin by apologising for Brexit, which is the exact opposite of what we should have been doing. And I really, sorry. It was the saddest day of my life when we voted to leave the European Union. I think you're absolutely right that you have, if the if the bad people are operating in a cross-border way, then the good people have to operate cross-border as well. And that's true whether it's the illegal or questionable financial flows of oligarchs investing their money, stealing in one country, investing in another, or whether it's cybercrime or people trafficking or anything else, that we clearly, I think the strongest argument against national sovereignty as your only plank in your platform is to say that the bad guys don't respect national sovereignty, and therefore we have to have international solutions to these problems. And that's, in a way, is quite a good argument, an easy argument to win, because it gets into this business of people being scared. People are scared of criminals, they're scared of the sort of international money laundering classes and angry about it, and so they're willing to accept solutions. But I think that what Ralf said is very important, that the absolute building block of our system is institutions. And once you start having trust in an institution and loyalty towards an institution and the willingness to put that institution over your personal and family interests, then we're getting somewhere. And you see this really strongly in countries that don't have institutions. People retreat into their individual world, their family world, their tribe or their clan or whatever. And things start breaking down. So we really need to cherish and strengthen our institutions and the loyalty and trust that we have in them. That's the basis of our sort of rules-based order. I also agree very much we need to do a better job in ensuring, in providing insurance, whether it's financial or other sorts of insurance, against change. We can't expect the weakest and most vulnerable people in society to bear the biggest costs relative to their own welfare of these huge social and economic and other changes that we're seeing. Because if we don't give them insurance against change, then they vote for Trump. Then they vote in an anti-systemic way. I'm slightly worried about the use of the word populist, by the way. I always feel populist is a word for a politician who I don't like, who's getting lots of votes. So I'm cautious about using populist as a... if we liked them, we wouldn't call them populist. We'd call them successful. So I prefer simplistic and nostalgic, which I think are slightly more precise terms. But I think perhaps the biggest way of restoring trust in society, if that's what we think we need to do to provide democratic legitimacy and leadership, is to deal with what is widely perceived as a climate of impunity for cheats. When you see other people breaking the rules and getting away with it, whether they're buying political protection, buying protection from the political justice system, simply putting their money in places where they don't pay any taxes, it corrodes the willingness among everybody else to play by the rules as well. And I think this has been one of our biggest failures since 1989, has been this idea of indulgence and tolerance towards people who really don't deserve any indulgence and tolerance, whether it's they're doing it for criminal or questionable political motives, whether it's oligarchs in Ukraine and Russia and other countries, or their counterparts in this country. And I think once we say that the rules do apply to everybody and make that really visible, then we're in a position to start hoping and maybe expecting that everybody else wants to play by the rules as well. And finally, I absolutely agree. I think we need a sense of cultural confidence. You know, there's this kind of Spenglerian feeling that the West is in total decline, which paradoxically comes at a time when millions and millions of people are paying huge sums of money relative to their income and risking their lives to try and get to the West. And what I find really striking is that some of the most left-wing and critical people of the system in Britain, so the hard lefties, are all who think that Britain is absolutely disgraceful country and horrible in every respect. And yet they go and volunteer with their own time to try and help migrants in the jungle in Calais. And I find that a real paradox. They think that Britain is an absolutely terrible place, and yet they're spending a lot of their time and energy trying to help migrants and refugees who are trying to get to Britain. And the fact that so many people are voting with their feet to try and get to our society maybe should remind us that it can't actually be as bad as sometimes we think.
Thank you.
If I comment on
Oleksandra.
that, I totally agree with some good points on institutions, because that's basically what, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of Ukraine and the experience that I have in Ukraine. We have been focusing on creation of institutions because this is where the trust begins. And we have created a number of new institutions that are now need to be under continuous protection of us, civil society in particular, from trying to sabotage their job and their work. And in terms of fighting against populism, we do have populist parties, politicians in Ukraine as well. And the reason why many people, many Ukrainians support them is a little bit different from why many people, I think, to my point of view, why many people support populists in developed countries. In developed countries, sometimes it's about everything being good. It's the lack of something new happening, some fight happening. So that's the reason why, to my point of view, in developed countries, this situation when populists are highly supported emerged. While in Ukraine, everything has been so bad for so long that everybody wants some peace, and some populists who promise this peace and welfare for everyone get supported. And the only one way to fight against those populists is the civil society controlling them, fulfilling their political promises. That's the role of the civil society in this fight against populism, because when you get populists in power, then the only one way to get them out of this power is basically to prove that they are lying. That's what you were saying. So that's the crucial role of the civil society, to continuously control between the elections how every single politician is fulfilling his obligations taken before the elections. Thank you.
Carol?
Thank you. Well, you know, the problem is actually more difficult even than you described it, because you did not talk about the demographic problem, which obviously exacerbates the lack of government resources. There are more old people who need public resources, fewer young people to be productive laborers and so forth. There's the immigration problem. And there's technology. And one of the things that the technology has done is that it has reduced patience. Everybody wants instant answers because you can get information instantly. And democracy is a very messy process, and we recognize that a lot of these problems are long-term problems, and you become vulnerable to somebody who's a strong man who comes and says, I can solve problems very, very quickly. So it's very difficult. And I think, let me just say two things that I think are very important to do. One is that our international institutions, our governments, I'm thinking of IMF now especially, they have to move from a focus on austerity to a focus on investment in infrastructure. They have to send the signal that they care about people who are, being affected by globalization. They have to be less concerned about opportunities for capital and more concerned about opportunities for labor. This is a fundamental change that has to take place. And second is the geopolitical. I don't think we can begin to think about how to address these problems if we lose sight of the global geopolitical dimension here. And I think, I agree with what's been said about the centrality of Ukraine. I've believed for a long time that Ukraine is the epicenter of the global struggle for democracy, and if Ukraine can succeed, I really think it's the end of Putinism. It's maybe the beginning of a normal Russian nationalism and the end of Putinism, and to have a country neighboring Russia where a lot of people speak Russian and speak it freely without government oppression, I think will be an enormous influence on Russia. So we have to begin to think of Ukraine not as sometimes people in Europe think of it, as a buffer zone, and not as sometimes some people in the United States think of it, as a European problem or part of the Russian sphere of influence. We have to think of it as a strategic partner. Hanna Hopko, the brilliant young woman who's head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Ukrainian Parliament, said this recently. And if we can do that, and also obviously we have to have a global perspective here because the problems truly are global, we can begin to maybe turn things around internationally. But I agree that I think it's going to be very, very difficult to do that unless we can address the internal problems and give our populations a sense that their concerns are being addressed. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to develop the will and the focus on the international problems if we can't address these internal problems.
Last question from my side, and then please, if there is, yes, immediately I will give you, oh, okay, no question from my side, there are questions from audience, and many questions, so, microphone, have we? So, please, yes, and then you, yes, please introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm coming from Scandinavia, from Norway, member of the International Law Organization, but my background is that I was an ambassador of Iran, a career diplomat, after the Khomeini taking over, bad leader. Okay. I had to defect my embassy and join the Iranian resistance. My question is about the leadership. You mentioned very well that the leadership is very pivotal in the history. Modern history and also old history. There are two factors in shaping the destiny of the nations. What is the solid factions, like, for example, non-literal, being a literal country, or situated as a vicinity of Russia or Soviet Union. These are the facts. But also there are many other factors with the non-solid factor. And leadership comes here as the first factor to shape the destiny of the nations. And here I'm mentioning that the leaders are so important, both in the democracies and also in the resistance movements, because you will see that there is a lack of leadership in Europe, the weakness, and we can see that. But also, the people who are fighting for democracy in the resistance, they turn into devils later, like malignant, cancerous things. And then that's why we have to be very careful because those leaders who come after the dictators in the resistance, they will be shaping. I want to mention, for example, bad leaders in the history, but also in the Iranian resistance. We have a lady, we have Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, who is a Muslim, and who is also having a 10-point program for the Iranian future. And such type of leaders, they should be helped, not those who become Robert Mugabe later or become
Deeply sorry, I do not want to be impolite, but also others have an interest,
that was my question.
Only the question.
Question is, do you agree that choosing the bad leaders both in democracies and also in the resistance is a big mistake, and that will shape the future of all of us? Thank you.
Get it.
Okay, next two questions there, and then I will give the floor from this side. Okay, please.
My name is Ivan Lubovitsky. I'm from Ukraine. I'm very supportive of the idea of institutions, but then there is a second part to this equation, which is culture. We often say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I would also say that culture may eat institutions for breakfast. And the question is, what do we have to do with the culture so it doesn't endanger the institutions? Because if we do only the institutional part, we're going to end up where we ended up in the 90s in the former Soviet Union. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was one more question. Here, gentleman, and then I will go to another side.
My name is Pavel Beneš. It was no speech about the fear, because the courage means fear, because the courage means fight against the fear, and the role of fear is very important.
Okay, thank you very, very much for this point. And fourth question, and then I will ask panelists to react.
Thank you. I will speak from a southern perspective because I think it was today absent here. Ralf said that today we were unable to solve some ongoing conflicts in the region, especially in Syria and Libya and elsewhere. And this, you agree, between Europe and the southern Mediterranean, there is an impact. The crisis, the migration crisis, the refugee crisis. Don't you think that Europe, like Carl said, should not only solve its internal problems, but should look also at its neighborhood? Because we feel today the European Union has not an ambition, has not the necessary tools to address the issues. Of course, we need to do our own homework. Today, democracy, we share the same values, but stability and security are essential. And today, the fight against extremism and jihadism is essential. We should also, in this connection, work together, because without stability, we cannot build a zone of shared prosperity in our region.
Yes, thank you. Who wants to start? Okay, Carol?
Just two. I'll just answer quickly. First, on the last question, there's no question that Putin views immigration as a weapon to destabilize Europe. If that is understood, then I think people can make the connection between the security internationally and dealing with domestic problems, because you're dealing with international opponents who want to disrupt in every way possible your domestic situation and to make all the problems we're talking about much, much more difficult. On the issue of culture, I agree, but I think we also have to recognize that culture changes over time. It takes a long and difficult process. The Nobel laureate in literature, Svetlana Alexievich, talked about Homo Sovieticus. How do you get the communism out of the soul and out of the mind, in addition to out of the political system? It's very, very difficult. And I would just call attention to, in Ukraine, to what I think is a very important institution, which is the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, which is really trying to create a new generation based upon values of individual responsibility and to get beyond this Homo Sovieticus. I think that's very, very critical.
Ralf, please.
I would like to comment on that culture and institutions, then question raised by Evgen. From the point of view of the liberal political theory, we would say proper institutions are the best provision to maintain a democratic political culture. So, division of powers, independent judiciary, high standard education, which is also part of republican institutions, independent media, extremely important, independent media, and a vivid, in addition to that, a vivid, lively civil society as kind of watchdog and counterweight to power politics. So it's a little bit tricky, you know, and a slippery slope to talk about that culture independently from institutions, because there's a risk that you finally end in re-education. Now, it's not about, at least that's not a political task to change the mindset of people. Maybe it's the task of religion or of literature, of arts. But politically, we should focus on a proper set of public institutions which are the best guarantee against authoritarian attempts or against corruption, whatever. And the second point on fear, you are absolutely right. If you're looking to the Trump campaign, this is politics of fear. And if you're looking to the European debate on immigration, this is about politics of fear. And I think the answer should not only be to stick on values, but to develop confidence that we are able to deal with these challenges, be it of free trade and economic globalization, or be it of immigration, in a proper way, so to provide political solutions if it comes to the immigration issue, how to integrate these immigrants in our political and social fabric, and at the same time how to restore control over our external borders. So it is about politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Edward?
Yeah, it's a very good question, this, about institutions, and you're absolutely right that an institution can't survive in a culture that tries to corrode it. And if playing by the rules is stupid and you lose, then it makes much more sense not to play by the rules, and the institution then suffers as a result. But I think people are basically rational, and if they see a working institution that does what it's supposed to do, then they will play by the rules, particularly if there's some sort of penalty for not playing by the rules. So I think one has to try and create a kind of critical mass. And you can do that, for example, if you have one part of the country where the institutions really work, then that is a sort of platform for spreading the strength of those institutions. And I totally endorse what Karl said about UKU, the Ukrainian Catholic University. This is a university where you don't pay a bribe to get in, and you don't pay a bribe to get a good result at the end. And as a result, it's very popular, because people, given the choice, would rather have a decent degree and decent teaching than something that is less good, because fundamentally institutions protect the weak against the strong, and most of us individually are weak. If you don't have institutions, then the result is that the rich and the powerful and the well-connected get things their way, and the rest of us have to put up with it. And most people, given the choice, would rather not live in that sort of society.
Thank you. Now this side, sorry deeply, I have to give the chance from this side microphone. So, gentleman, then gentleman. Yeah, I see you.
Thank you very much for the very brilliant presentations. My name is Erkin Gadirli. I'm from Azerbaijan. I'm from Republican Alternatives Oppositional Movement. Now, I have a very provocative question. As you said, that truth can be sometimes unpopular. And, you know, maybe there is no crisis. Maybe it's just a normal logical development, because if it is true that the quality of the government reflects the quality of the voter, then perhaps it is true that the quality of the voter is continuously declining, that they elect such politicians in their government. And if my assumption is true, then maybe the answer lies elsewhere. Because one of the paradoxes of democracy is that democracy depends on certain non-democratic institutions, such as judiciary, police, bureaucracy, academic institutions, financial system, perhaps even army. None of them are democratic in the sense that they are not elected by the people, they are not responsible to the people, but their proper function contributes or prevents democracy. Now, if judicial process becomes too lengthy and too expensive, then social conflicts will have it the other way.
Please, question.
So, sorry for taking too much time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, because I need to give the space. There, then there is a lady, yeah.
Thank you very much. Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. It takes a little vision to see the needs of the future and to know the answers today. And I'd like to thank Forum 2000 for the perspicacity and our distinguished guests to come and discuss the problems of the courage to take responsibility. The success of the Ukrainian Revolution for Dignity is of strategic importance to the West. It's time that we look at policy. to open our eyes and realize that the largest concentration of Russian modern military equipment since the Korean War is currently deployed in the Donbass, in Crimea, and on the border of the Ukraine. But the problem of finding leadership in these difficult times requires that we look in new places. And part of the answer, I believe, is in supporting the creation on a large scale of small businesses in Ukraine. Many people have worked in state institutions, in factories for decades, and they have forgotten the skills that were traditional in Ukraine of small businesses. I'm calling for an international program with the European Union, EFTA, the United States, Canada, and other international allies, such as Australia and New Zealand, to create a program to support many small businesses in Ukraine, 5 owners or less, in the effort to try to remove the potential for abuse by oligarchical teams, with affordable, internationally sponsored small business loans, including for startups.
Please.
That's the question. That's the challenge. I'd like to have your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, lady.
Jana Outrata, I am a local girl, but I worked for 23 years for the Canadian Civil Service. And just the speaker mentioned these unelected bodies that are very, very necessary for a well-functioning state. In Czech Republic, I've been discussing this issue umpteen times, and people always blame the politicians, but they never realized that the politicians didn't admit existence of independent civil service, a mechanism that transforms what the politicians need, advise them, this won't go through, this is reasonable, but you have to take in consideration, blah, 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 because they've been in their position for years and they understand what they are doing. The politicians come to a ministry, bring their friends, and this is it. They kick out at the top level of knowledgeable specialists, and other people are scared they will lose their jobs, so they don't give advice. There where are situations like issuing a passport or doing simple,
please.
That works. But how come local politicians don't realize this?
Last 2 questions, and then okay, 3, but brief. Here and 2 there.
Shlomo Avineri, Israel. I'd like to come back to the issue of values and to what Ralf Fücks said. Democratization, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, was connected with the market economy. And obviously the two are connected. But there is a tension there, because democracy is talking about community. Market economy is talking about individualism, about competition, about everyone being, in a way, in competition, in war with everybody else. And perhaps the time has come back to bring into debate the issue of solidarity, not national ethnic solidarity, which is what we see all over, but the issue of social solidarity and social responsibility. And this means that one has to look a little bit more carefully about the connection between the market economy and globalization and democracy. There are obviously links, but there are also some contradictions, and we have to rethink and a little bit decoupling the two issues.
Thank you. And yes. 2 gentlemen, and then I'm sorry, because of the time, I have to close the session. Yeah?
My name is Rami Jahanbeglu. I'm the director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace and on the program committee of Forum 2000. Thank you to the panelists. We talked about the crisis of the democratic leadership, but not too many people talked about the crisis, the moral crisis that we have in democracies today. Actually, the last leaders with moral capitals that we had were Mandela and Havel, and people are not very trustful. This is my question. How can they be, for example, the American elections are coming up, and there was a poll and that even if they vote for Secretary Clinton, 70% of the Americans are distrustful of Clinton. So how can we get the moral capital back to the leaders in democracies? Thank you.
Yes, and the last question?
I'm Danny Teal, and first of all, I want to say I have 3 statements to make, very simple.
Micro. Yeah.
That I am 100% for Donald Trump. I don't appreciate this liberal democracy that's going on stage because I think it's one-sided. Second point is, I don't believe that democracy is capable of making or establishing leadership unless it's in fear or it's in conflict. And the third one to the gentleman from Germany, and against the institutionalization that's being represented here, is that the public will come up with an answer to your economic globalization, as it has already done. And if you're not familiar with blockchain technology, you will see that it will decentralize all of the efforts that are being made to contain the public of the world in your centralized and institutional plans.
Thank you very much. We are in democratic atmosphere. So it's normal that somebody have different position and preferences, because if we are talking about democracy, there are not only institutions, but moral principles, and these are at least 3: tolerance, trust, and solidarity. So tolerance is also inside this room, I am absolutely sure. Now I will give the floor to last really minute to conclude of each panelist and try to find the common answer to the questions which were our statements on the floor. Please, who will start? Oleksandra?
Okay, we have discussed so many different questions. Could you please say again the question that we're answering now at different points? Okay. So, can democracy produce...
You can choose. You can choose to which of the comment or question you would like to answer or react. It's totally on you.
Okay. I would like to comment on what you just said about the businesses and supporting small business, medium business in Ukraine. Of course, because small and medium business is the basis for development of democratic state, because they are independent. This is the middle class that forms the independent democratic state. That is why the current elites will not let that happen, as well as they will be threatening and not letting us work, because we are independent as much as the middle classes. So before doing that help or helping particular people in Ukraine, it is very much important to first create these institutions that will be able to control how this money are used. Second, to reform all those institutions that are responsible, law enforcement, taxation, judiciary, because what has been happening now in Ukraine is not a real reform, unfortunately. It's just a way to show that we're willing to do that, but we're not willing to jeopardize ourselves. This is their logic. So that is why it is so important to bring these new people to the government, to bring new people to the parliament who will be not doing this mock-up, but will be true reformists and will be able to introduce these changes for real. So before doing what you were saying, it is, I'm stressing this over and over again, it is important to bring these new people, and civil society can produce these new people and new leaders. So it is very important to first of all support those who are these future leaders, for them to get into power and be able to reform the state.
Thank you. Edward?
2 brief points. First of all, I'm so glad that the gentleman there, Mr. Teal, your name, mentioned blockchain, because we haven't really touched on technology, and I think that we are facing an enormous transformative change, not just in the economy, but also in our politics, from what is very loosely called e-government. And I don't know if there's anyone from Estonia here, but I really urge everybody here to look at some of the things that are happening in Estonia, the way you use a strong digital identity with strong cryptography behind it as your basis for interaction both with business and with government, the idea that the citizen owns their data, the end of centralized databases and so on. This is all tremendously important. The other point I want to make, bring together the comment from Azerbaijan and my friend from Israel, is that I think it's too narrow to say that democratic institutions are just about the ones that are elected. An army and armed forces that are under constitutional control is a democratic institution. The judiciary is a democratic institution. So all these things are absolutely, just because they're not elected doesn't mean that they're not part of the system. And I think this point about business is absolutely fundamental. I actually think business can be part of civil society. Business, actually, if you think about it, is not simply about maximizing profit. And there's a very simple illustration of this. When businesses sue, and they do sue each other in courts, they don't go to court and say, how much do I have to pay the judge to get the right answer? Businesses expect actually to work in the framework of democratic institutions. And I think it's been a bit of a delusion of the last 20 years that businesses have taken this very narrow focus and said the only thing that matters is to get our profits up. Actually, it isn't the only thing that matters. You can see that very clearly. They don't expect to steal their way to profits. They would be horrified if their opponents were breaking the law and distorting the environment in order to maximize their profit. So we absolutely need business on side. Business can only flourish properly if the democratic institutions are working, and that means that business must contribute to that, not just small businesses, although that's great, but medium and big businesses as well, because if they don't, the atmosphere becomes just as corrosive for them as it is for us individuals.
Thank you. Carol?
You know, one word following up on what Ed was just saying that has not been mentioned here is the word growth, economic growth. And you're not going to get economic growth without business. You can't get it from the state. Obviously, there's a tension, as Shlomo said, between market economy and democracy. But I think we have to develop more the concept of inclusive democracy. Not to get rid of the markets, but how to have democracy reach out and serve the interests of all the people. I think that's a very central concept in the work of for democracy today. Finally, on Ramin's question about moral leadership, you know, one advantage that Mandela and Havel had is they fought against a dictatorship, and they developed their moral stature in fighting against the dictatorship. Democracy is a messy system. It's very hard to develop that kind of moral stature dealing with the complexities of democratic politics. It's my hope. I mean, I believe that we face a major global crisis of democracy today, more serious than any crisis democracy has faced since the Second World War, certainly since the end of the Cold War, but I believe even since the Second World War. We're really in the middle of a major global crisis of many, many different dimensions. It is my hope, you know, crisis can produce leaders of moral stature, and let's hope that that's one good thing to come out of this crisis.
Thank you. Ralf, conclusion? Remarks?
Maybe on the solidarity issue, I agree very much that solidarity is a source of democracy, then in terms of creating a sense of mutual responsibility and a sense of belonging. So solidarity is a societal task. It is about the feeling to be responsible for the other. But then the question arises, who is included and who is excluded? Now the populists, especially the right-wing populists, they have a notion of national solidarity, excluding the foreigners, excluding the strangers. So, and we need another concept of open solidarity, of kind of inclusive solidarity, it beyond the national and ethnic communities. So the term community is a little bit tricky. We need, I would say, an open and tolerant political community, but we have to be very critical against the idea of a kind of natural community of ethnic homogeneity. And the second remark on strong democratic institutions, this is not necessarily about centralization of power. I think we need a kind of multi-layer democratic system rooted in the local democracy. We have to strengthen local democracy as the area of self-government of citizens, giving them the rights and resources to then decide over the everyday life issues they have to deal with. So democracy has to be rooted in the municipalities, and then you need the regional, the national, and the transnational institutions to build a kind of regulatory framework for a globalized economy. So it is not about big government, essentially. It is about empowering people. Empowering people in a very comprehensive sense, socially and politically, to deal with a certain kind of self-confidence with a world of change. And I agree very much, we are in an era of transformational change, in an unprecedented pace and dimension. And enabling us to deal with change, I think this is at the very core of the future of young democracies.
Thank you very much. Let me thanks to Oleksandra, to Edward, to Karl and Ralf, and thank you very, very much for your attention. Have a nice, powerful and good discussion hall these days in Prague at the Forum 2000. Thank you very much.